So we wanted to talk about campaign finance. Pete Quist is the research director for at followthemoney.org. He's recently focused on the best practices for disclosure of money in state politics. Before that, he spent 2 years at Project Vote Smart, where he tracked the progress of congressional and state legislation, summarized key bills in plain language, and compiled voting records. So I've asked Pete to come and give an overview of the resources that they have, and not just the the calculation of how much money is going to politicians or candidates, but what the connection is between money going in and legislation being proposed. So Pete is going to give us an overview of the different ways that you can use the data they have and show you how to do it, and then we will draw it out. So Pete, welcome, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and just share my screen here and go through what I'd like to talk about today. So this is our homepage at followthemoney.org. And here at the National Institute on Money and Politics, we've been collecting campaign finance data at the state level for about 20 years. And this includes contributions to every candidate running for state government office, legislative candidates and gubernatorial candidates, and candidates for cabinet level positions in the states that elect those, and judicial candidates as well. And I'll get into some more detail on that in a moment. But this is the heart of what we do. We also do some additional data on independent expenditures and lobbying information. And we're doing this everything that I'm about to show you is free for journalists to use. We spend a lot of time in the back end in spreadsheets, and you'll hear me say this quite a bit during this presentation. It is really heartening for us to work with folks that are getting good use out of this data. It's why we do what we do. So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is just kind of background on regulation and tying it into what the data looks like, and then moving into how we try to package that data in a way that you can tie it to governance. There's a lot to cover here. My intention with a presentation like this is not so that you will walk away knowing how to do everything that I'm about to show you, but just so that you know what's kind of available, and then give us a call. And our phone number is on the bottom of every page on our website. And I actually answer the phone, so please reach out. And that's what we're here for. So as I mentioned, the 3 avenues of money that we cover are campaign contributions, independent expenditures, and lobbying data. And this is important, as you guys know, to try to tie accountability to governance. It's not just gotcha stories, though, although that is certainly one of the values here. If you see something that's somebody's making large donations to a candidate and seems to be getting preferable policy choices, that's absolutely a story that needs to be written. But some of the data can be used for other stories, such as just measuring the overall health of an election, of campaign finance in a state. Most recently, there have been some analyses using our data to look at the effects of small donor public funding matching programs in New York and what that will look like and that sort of thing. So, and those findings have found that candidates tend to raise money in different patterns. They actually go out and solicit money from different donors, depending on sort of the parameters of public financing programs, and using some case studies to kind of measure that. So other kinds of stories as well. And we're happy to help with any of that stuff. As we collect this data, we're going actually to each state agency and getting the data. So sometimes this data is available through an electronic download from a state. Sometimes it's available through scanned images of handwritten paper reports. There is one state yet where we get some campaign finance reports sent to us in the mail, and we get it all. We make a list of every report that might have to be filed for an election, and we gather that and key it in if we have to, and then go through a robust process to make sure that what we've keyed in is accurate, with a separate check going through that. Our database is used extensively for academic purposes, so we need to maintain those standards as well. So, before I get into our data too much, I also want to make sure that people are aware of other organizations that may be helpful for them as they're doing reporting. I understand you guys have the Campaign Legal Center on. That's one of the key ones to be aware of. But on the menu in the upper left of our homepage here, you click on resources and organizations, you can get a list of a lot of valuable organizations. I'll mention a couple here. The Campaign Legal Center obviously is one. The Campaign Finance Institute is actually a division of our organization, and I'll mention them in more detail in a moment. Most of you will be aware of the Center for Responsive Politics, which has extensive campaign finance data at the federal level going back about 30 years. The Center for Political Accountability is working on getting voluntary campaign finance disclosure from publicly traded companies, and particularly where they're engaged in independent spending activity that may not be reported at the state level. And Good Jobs First has incredible databases that they're putting together, looking at things like violations and fines that companies are receiving for things like environmental violations in states, and tax subsidies that companies may be receiving, state contracts and that sort of thing. And they actually tie their data, they tie our data into their data, so you can start doing that accountability piece. And Little Sis is the last one I'll mention here. They are largely crowdsourcing their work, but trying to draw lines between, trying to draw relationships. So if you find somebody that is coming up in a story and want to see if they have relationships with other people that might be showing up in your data sets or just in your stories in general, Little Sis is a great resource to get actual relationship maps kind of a thing. So I mentioned that the Campaign Finance Institute is a division of our organization, and I wanted to highlight one of tool that we have through that website, which is at cfinst.org. Hoping to migrate this over to the Follow the Money website soon, but it's this database of state laws. One thing to keep in mind as you're writing stories is that every state has its own regulations about campaign finance disclosure, contribution limits, and essentially every piece of campaign finance. This tool is a great resource for putting practices in your state into context. So for example, right now we're looking at contribution limits from individuals to candidates for the state house or assembly. And this map is showing you what the contribution limits are in these kinds of brackets here to the right. And if I mouse over the $1,000 or less, you can see which states have the lowest contribution limits for individuals giving to candidates for the lower chamber, and so forth. And if you mouse over a state, you can actually get what that limit is. This is all normalized over a 2-year period as well. Some states have limits that are applicable to different timeframes. Washington State has limits that are applicable to the number of voters in your district. So every legislative candidate is subject to a slightly different contribution limit. This normalizes everything to make it comparable across states. So as you're looking at, if you've got major donors showing up in your state, and you're interested in just like what are neighboring states doing in terms of capping that or disclosing that, there's a lot of information here, and you can download most of it as well. And you can alter this to look at contributions from other sources or to other kinds of candidates. This in particular, I think, is really interesting and good to be aware of. This is looking at whether corporations can make contributions from their treasuries to candidates for state house. At the federal level, when you see quote unquote corporate money, what you're seeing is contributions from PACs to candidates for the US House or US Senate or president. And those PACs are funded by individuals associated with that company, usually executives and board members. This map is showing you where the corporations don't have to do that. They can just give directly to the candidates themselves. And similarly for the labor unions. And it's about half the states for those corporations and unions. And there's a lot of other things in here. Our employment information required to be reported for donors and that sort of thing. This is all just a wealth of information to put your state into context with other states. All right, let's talk about data. This is my favorite stuff. I love data. I'm a data head. I like to talk about this a lot. And if I scroll down here, we can go over, I mentioned a little bit some of the data that we collect, but on our homepage at followthemoney.org, this is a breakdown of the data sets that we have. So you can see, as I mentioned, we have contributions to state elections going back to 2000, the 2000 election cycle. We also began getting, we expanded that into the intermediate appellate courts in the mid-2000s and have been gathering that ever since. Candidates for judicial office are tending to raise a little bit more money than they used to in the states where that kind of office is elected. And some of that is in response actually to the Citizens United decision that allowed increased outside spending funding sources where particularly candidates for retention have traditionally not raised money. This is a yes or no on keeping them in office. But in the last few years, they've started to raise money in a lot of states because of those independent expenditure campaigns coming in. Contributions to political parties. and to ballot measure committees as well in all 50 states, and or to the extent that there are any ballot measures in your state. And so we can run searches across all of this, and I'll demonstrate that soon. And then we've been getting independent expenditures in some states since 2006. The number of states in which we get independent expenditures is 29. There are a few states where you don't have to report any independent expenditures when you make them. And there are many states where you don't have to report certain kinds of independent expenditures when you make them. And I'll get into that a little bit more a little later. We've also expanded to contributions to federal campaigns since 2010. I'll be focusing on state campaigns for this demonstration though. And then we have lists of registered lobbyists and their clients in every state since 2006. So we can see who's registered to lobby and who they're employing to do that lobbying for them. And we have the money spent on lobbying in 20 states. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in 50 states a little later as well. Then we have some select local jurisdictions, which I will be kind of glossing over today. But they are New York City, Washington, DC, and Chicago. So what I'm going to do is run a couple of searches here, kind of demonstrate how the data looks, how to kind of get around in it, what value we add to it with the work that we do to try to make this more usable than just raw campaign finance data from the states for you guys. And once I've done that and shown a couple of uses of it, I will stop for a minute and ask for some questions. And then I'll get into a little bit more of the independent spending and lobbying background, and then into a couple of tools after that that try to tie the campaign finance information to governance. So as we get this data, we are doing a couple of things with it. One of them is that as we're collecting these campaign contributions, we are classifying the contributors by economic interest. So if we go to the menu in our data and about our data, you can get a breakdown of what these interests sort of look like. And this has some background about where they come from. But these are very broad classifications here. So you can look at, for example, the health industry. And these are all things that we'll be able to search by too, which I'll show in a minute. But within health, we do subclassifications. So you can look at things like pharmaceutical and health products specifically. Or get even more specific than that and look at wholesale pharmaceutical companies. And what this means is that on the interface that I'm about to show you, we could do a search for contributions from everything within health, which would include hospitals and that sort of thing, or we could get really specific or anywhere in between. So as you're writing issue stories and thinking about whether or not there might be a campaign finance angle on what a state is considering, this is a really useful tool to be able to look at if certain industries are involved in the story, we can look at those donors. All right, so the main entry point that I'm going to show here is our Ask Anything search, and it's up in the upper right. There are a couple of places you can get to this, but it's basically an advanced search engine, and it allows you to hopefully ask about anything that you can come up with. As the years have gone by and we have received questions where our public-facing interface was not able to provide an answer, we have added on to it. It is our ethos that if you can't answer a question with the interface we're providing, then we need to make it better. This is supposed to be trying to make the data as transparent as possible. But there is a lot, there are a lot of options here as a result. So again, as I go through this, it won't be an expectation on my end anyway that people memorize everything, but just to know what's kind of available. And then to reach out and contact me. So here we get a little pop-up. It says currently looking at contribution data. And then we have a couple of buttons here that are contributions from and contributions to. And these are the main buttons that we're going to use to build a query here. And I'm going to go over some of the options, then I'll run a basic search. So under contributions from, we can ask for contributions from all kinds of sources. So if you want to look at contributions from a specific contributor, or even a list of a few contributors, you can do that here. And it's just searching for contributions by the name of a contributor. or if you want to do multiple, you can click on the select multiple, and you can start typing in names. You'll get some results down here, and you can select the ones that you like, and they end up in this currently selected box. You just keep typing more names. You can basically build a list as long as you want. If you have a really long list, reach out to us, because we can offer services that are better than typing in a bunch of names. If you have a file, we can process that for you and return data for you. You can do contributions from subsidiaries and employees of organizations, the industries. So this is the same list that we were just looking at. So we can do contributions from health. And if we, anytime you see these little black arrows, it means that there are more options. And so we can open that up. You can see everything is selected below health because I've selected health. And you see those same subclassifications here, and I can get really specific with them. We can also do contributions from certain locations. So if you're interested in looking at contributions from maybe the town that a legislator represents, or some set of towns that the legislator represents, you can see where those contributions are coming from, or maybe from outside of that town. So what we oftentimes see in many states is that the first time somebody's elected, they are receiving a lot of individual contributions from the district that they are trying to represent. And then after that, we will see a lot of non-individual contributions, PACs and the like, from the capital. The types of contributors allows you to look for contributors that are individuals versus non-individuals. So political action committees, corporations, unions, and allow you to sort of get a look at how grassroots somebody's campaign may be in terms of where they're getting their money from. And then the types of records is looking for contributions by date and dollar amount ranges. So pretty much anything that we have in the database is a field that you can search by in this interface. And then in contributions to, we can look at contributions to candidates, to sitting office holders, which I'll touch on, to ballot measure committees and to political party committees. To some extent, you can look at contributions to independent spenders. If you're writing a story about independent expenditures, reach out to us right away, and we'll help you sort of understand what the parameters are there. And then this filer is just kind of a catch-all, or you can look at contributions to states and years in general. But within these, you can even get very specific. So if I click on candidates, we can look at contributions to a specific candidates that are running against each other in a given race, candidates for types of offices such as gubernatorial, cabinet level positions, legislative and judicial offices. All those offices that we track are searchable. You can look at contributions to candidates that are winners or losers, or by political party or incumbency, pretty much anything that you'd like to look at that's available through campaign finance and election data. Again, we're also trying to tie election data into campaign finance data so that you can get these breakdowns that aren't necessarily available from the state's campaign finance agency, which may not have information about incumbency or win-loss status. The office holders options are very similar to the candidate options, although one notable exception is that you can look at office holders by legislative committee. So you can do searches for contributions to legislative committee members. And that is something that I will get into here in a little bit. You can also look at contributions to members of the legislature who are in leadership positions. We track, we document who is in the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the majority and minority leaders in each chamber. And then I'll kind of gloss over these last two, but with ballot measures, we can look at contributions to ballot measure committees that are working on a specific ballot measure, or by subject. So if you want to look at contributions to committees that are working on ballot measures across the country that are working on some energy issues or housing issues or something like that, you can absolutely do that here. And political party committees by Republican and Democratic Party committee, state and year, and that sort of thing. I'm going to run just kind of a simple search here just to demonstrate how this works. So what we'll do is contributions to a few states in the last couple of years. And so I'm going to do, we're going to try to build a sentence using these buttons. So I'm going to do contributions to certain states. So we'll do contributions to campaigns in certain states. So it's contributions to, and then specific state. So we've got these black arrows here. If I click on this one, then we'll expand the list of states. And we're going to just grab Arkansas, Alaska, and Arizona right now. And then I click OK. You can select as many as you'd like. I'm selecting these ones because they're a little bit, they're not overly large, and there is some interesting information in the campaign finance there. And I want this to load quickly. So these states are a good kind of demonstration. And then we'll do contributions to elections in the last couple of years. You can see that we've got years prior to 2000. 2000 is when our data really began. We backfilled some data prior to that, but it is not as consistently done. If you have questions about going back more than 20 years in campaign finance data, which you might, just reach out to us and we can kind of help you out with what that would mean. So you can see I'm building a sentence that says, show me contributions to candidates and committees and elections in these 3 states in these 2 years. And then the last thing that I'm going to do, because we have US House and US Senate races, that would include elections in these 3 states would include those. I'm going to limit this, it says within federal, state, and local data here. Just going to limit this to state data. Within state data. And I'll click go. So I am now looking at all the contributions to campaigns, candidates, party committees, ballot measure committees, to some extent, independent spending committees in these 3 states over these two election years. And you can see right off, I get a results page with 168,000 contributions, totaling $117 million here. This is a typical results page on a query like this. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I'll come back in so you guys can see it a little bit better. But what we're looking at is a table underneath here. It's not obvious yet, but it has the same number of records and the dollar amount. And then the way that this interface will work for you is very similar to pivot tables in Excel. You can group this data in lots of different ways. So for example, if we want to know how much of this $117 million was raised by campaigns in each of these 3 states, we can click on this election jurisdiction box, and the table will aggregate that data by state for us. The number of records refers to the number of transactions. So the vast majority of transactions are in Arizona, and Arizona has about double the money of the next highest state in this list. We can add things like the sector. So this is this broad sector, general industry, and specific business. Those 3 things reflect the very like the health, and then the pharmaceuticals and health products, and then the wholesale pharmaceutical companies. So basically those 3 tiers. And if we add that broad tier, then we get a list where each row represents a state and a sector. And in this case, we see that although Arizona was by far the biggest state in terms of fundraising, Alaska energy and natural resources money is by far the biggest source of contributions from a sector in a state within this data set. And if we'd like to dive into what that looks like, we can do that using this magnifying lens. Anytime you have a table on this interface, there will always be a magnifying lens on the left side that allows you to dive into the data that makes up that row. Before I do, I will mention that there is uncoded here. What this reflects are contributions that we haven't categorized yet. Our system does a pretty good job about identifying contributors that it has seen before, that we've classified with their economic interest, using some tables in the background that I'll show you in a minute, that have name and address variations essentially that it recognizes. But to the extent that it doesn't identify a contributor and their economic interest, we as the staff will go through, there are just a couple of us that go through the data for the entire country and try to do that so that the system can learn from what we do. We start with the largest donors and work our way down as we do that. So you'll see that with this uncoded dollar amount, although it's relatively large, the number of records is relatively large too. The average contribution, if you were to divide this, is relatively small. So I'm clicking on the magnifying lens next to the energy and natural resources for Alaska, and you'll see that I've opened up a new browser tab. And this is showing me energy and natural resources contributions to Alaska. And so it's that easy. Got 758 contributions for that $19 million there. And then we can see who those contributors are, for example, by clicking on this contributor box. The main story here, though, for this data set is who the recipient is. What we've got with these checkboxes are just like we saw with the search interface: candidate, ballot measure committee, party committee, independent spender, and this filer is kind of a catch-all. This happens to be a ballot measure committee. If we click on it, then we can find out what this committee was doing. So if you click on the name of any person or group in our database, you will go to a page that is all of the information that we know about them. We're no longer associated just with that query anymore. This is One Alaska, vote no on one. This is going to tell you everything that we know about this organization, including, as a ballot measure committee, which measures it has supported or opposed. And in this case, it opposed a tax increase on the North Slope in Alaska. So by closing those prior tabs, I'm back at my original search. Every time you click on a name or a magnifying lens, it will open up a new browser tab for you so that you can maintain your prior search and work with that. And I'm removing the economic interest and just grouping by contributor here. So now I'm grouped by contributor and state. And we can see a list of the top donors in each state. I mentioned there's a lot of functionality here. As you can see, you can group this data by the party affiliation of candidates and so on. Pretty much any field, again, that we have is something that you can group this data by. So you can see how much contributions have come from an industry to winning Democratic candidates for state Senate across the years that you've chosen in the states that you've chosen, for example. But one of the other things that I mentioned was that we do a lot of standardization to try to group these contributions together for you. So for example, in this Hillcorp Energy, which is given $4 million here in Alaska, the number of records there is 5. That means that there are 5 transactions associated with that $4 million. Still pretty sizable transactions. If we click on Hillcorp Energy, we'll get a table of all the ways that we've standardized this. So as I mentioned, we're looking at name and address variations that we recognize as Hillcorp Energy. And this is all stuff that our system is automatically doing for you in the back end. So that if you're looking for contributions from Hillcorp Energy, regardless of what state you're looking in, regardless of what state they're making campaign contributions in, this information as it comes into our system will automatically standardize for you. So you don't have to look for all those different name variations that you will see in raw state campaign finance data. You're seeing this right now because I'm logged in as a member of the staff. You won't actually see this list publicly, but I want to show you what it kind of looks like. We also do that for individuals. So here you can get a list of all the name and address variations that we're recognizing as this individual, regardless of what they're doing in our system, making campaign contributions, running for office, and et cetera. Everything that I do on this interface is affecting the URL. So if you build a table that you like, you can embed that in a story using this URL. You can also export the data using this data export option, which is going to drop me down just to the bottom of the page, where there are, this is the table above, where there are export options in flat files or as API. And so you can stream this data to your own website. I want to highlight just a couple of, I'll just do one API example here to sort of show you what that might look like. So with ER data and APIs, this is where you get the documentation for APIs. And I really like to point these out because you can do essentially anything you want with this. It doesn't have to be a flat table. It can be. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution has a page where they just have a profile page for every legislator in Georgia. And they have all kinds of information from different sources that's streaming to their website for the profile page for each legislator. And one of those things is a table of their top 100 donors, and that's streaming from our website. This WRAL one is a little different. If we go to this example, this is a story announcing their new tool, where you can stream that data, top donors, to people. It's like they're mentioning sitting legislators here in their story. And if you mouse over the name, the top 5 donors are coming up, and that's streaming just from our website. So the sky's the limit on what you can do with that information. I'll take some questions there before I talk a little bit more. I'll talk very briefly about independent expenditures and lobbying. I'm not going to give an in-depth demo on it. I will just mention that the interfaces are very similar to what they were for the campaign contributions that we just looked at. But then I'd like to get into some of those tools about tying the data into governance.
Okay, so we'll have a question from Stephen Caruso. Then I have 3 text questions from Samantha, Laura Bischoff, and Stefan. So Stephen Caruso.
Hi, I'm Stephen. I'm in Pennsylvania at the Capital Star. I just kind of have a question on like where the data is coming from. Like I get Department of States, but because I guess what I'm interested in is that sometimes I've like used Follow the Money and tried to look up like donations from one county to another, and I've seen things that like, and this would have been last election cycle. So if like the site has changed a little since then, that's might be it. But like it looked like there's like duplicative listings. So it was kind of hard for me to tell, like, wait, are these just the same, or, you know, is it repeating? And then like, you know, I've gone then to like state documents and been able to figure it out which were duplicative and which were the actual donations. But so I guess I'm just like interested in like, what's the process that gets data from the departments of states, or, you know, like the governments into your, into Follow the Money?
Yeah, right. So every time I'll pull up a quick interface here. What I'm doing is running a query that you can do through the interface, but just typing it in. As I mentioned, the URL is reflecting everything that you do anyway. As we add candidates and committees to our system that we know we want campaign finance data for, we make a list of every report that they could conceivably have to file during the election cycle. So in this case, we're looking at contributions to state candidates and committees in Alaska 2020 elections. And there are 1,551 reports that could potentially be filed. As those report due dates go by, we go and collect those campaign finance reports as soon as we can. There is oftentimes a lag because we only have 6 people that are actually getting the data from the states. So we have to prioritize states, work with different formats and that sort of thing. But we get it as quickly as we can. And so we make sure that we're gathering every campaign finance report as it's filed. We do have a robust deduplication process that looks for possible duplicates and flags them for us to review. Sometimes what you'll see, if you do see anything questionable, please do reach out to us. There have been a few times during my time here where we have found an actual error, and it's always good to get that feedback. We will track that down for you and show you where the data came from for any specific thing that you're looking at. Sometimes though, what you'll see, particularly in states that have different contribution limits for or a duplicative contribution limit for primary and a general, where a candidate can raise X dollars for the primary and X dollars again for the general, is that you have people, depending on the rules, write 2 checks on the same day for the same amount, and that gets attributed to the primary and the general as well.
Okay, so I have a question from Laura Bischoff of the Daily News. Are you scraping the data from state databases automatically so it's the latest information?
Right, so we do scrape from many states. We use just download options where we can. We do have to piece together quite a bit of information. So in Nebraska, for example, we can download data from there, but they don't report the unitemized dollar amounts. So we have to actually look at like report totals and itemized totals and do the math to identify the unitemized dollars. Some states don't include other pieces like loans and loan repayments, returned contributions, certain other kinds of transactions within downloadable data sets. So we have a lot of experience working with each state's data. And so we know which pieces we can get through which formats. So we'll download where we can, go print reports to get the pieces that we need and key those in so that everything is complete. The data is as up to date as we can keep it, but there is that lag that I mentioned as well.
Okay. Steph, question from Stefan Johnson of New Amsterdam News. For pages that don't have reports released yet, is it because you're in the middle of working them or just don't have the info yet?
Yeah, so we are currently finishing up with the 2020 election data collection. We are about 97% complete with the number of, there are about 220,000 campaign finance reports at the state level that we're collecting for the 2020 elections, and we've got about 97% of them in. The stage that we're at right now with that is identifying why we don't have that other 3%. And oftentimes what that is that a candidate no longer was a candidate for some reason, deceased, disqualified, or something like that, or terminated their committee after losing a primary, and we're just making sure that we have that comprehensively done. But we're also at the same time moving into 2021 and just now beginning to collect those campaign finance reports for 2021. Where you don't see data yet, it's because either we haven't collected data yet, or we haven't collected data that matches your search parameters. So if you're doing a contribution for, or if you're doing a search for contributions from a specific donor or a specific industry, and we haven't identified contributions from that kind of a source within the data set that you're looking at, then the search will come up empty. Reach out to us though when you're seeing that. We're happy to look at that with you.
Okay, quick question from Samantha Modilano, who was from Politico, but Samantha has a new job. Congratulations, Samantha. I think just started today or something, right? But she asked this early on, so maybe you've covered this, but Pete, how local does the data breakdown get?
Yeah, so we can get down to transaction level data. So in this case, we're looking at 26,000 contributions totaling $33 million here. Record is this website's language for transaction. And so you can actually get down to the date and amount of each check. And so that's in terms of local as far as granular, that's the answer there. You can get down to that level if you'd like to. In terms of local for level of governance, we are collecting contributions to state candidates, and that does include state legislative candidates, which are about as local as you can get for state government office. Typically, we do not get contributions to like city council and county supervisors and that sort of thing, with the exception of New York City, Washington, D.C. city elections, and Chicago city elections.
Okay, and another question from Laura from Dayton. Any effort to track and disclose political spending by 501c4 organizations? They're a huge factor in Ohio public corruption case. Disclosure is limited to IRS 990 forms and 8872 forms. Yeah,
so independent expenditures is just, it's a tough animal when you have nonprofit organizations getting involved. And in some states, it's a tough animal. Nonprofit organizations are difficult because they can make contributions to candidates. Oftentimes, the corporate regulations apply to nonprofit corporations like 501c4s. And so we saw that many states allow corporations to make contributions to candidates. So you can see some dark money contributions directly to candidates in some states. We do track the independent expenditures to the extent that we can. On this Ask Anything, this is actually a button. So if I click contributions data, you can see I can switch to independent spending and lobbying spending data. If I click the independent spending data, you can see just another interface that looks a lot like the contributions data, but the buttons are a little different. You can run queries like this to see those expenditures, including who's making that expenditure, the 501c4, and actually get that data in the states where we do have it. Trying to get the sources of funding for the 501c4s is just really hard. Some states do require that if you make an independent expenditure, you report the contributions that you receive, usually trying to limit that to the amount of money that you're spending for reasons related to legal regulation. So what they'll do is require you to disclose contributions that were earmarked for the purpose, or use a last in, first out accounting method where you're reporting your most recent donors backwards until you account for that money. But what groups will do at that point is just form a political action committee in your state, and then the 501c4 will give to the PAC, and then the PAC will make the expenditure and report the dark money group as its donor. And so it's still problematic. California has a law that they passed in 2014 that tries to address that issue, where if you make a contribution or engage in politics in that state, and you are a dark money group, you report just as I described with the last in, first out. But if you report another dark money group, or if the PAC reports a dark money group, then that dark money group is ostensibly subject to disclosure requirements of the same sort to account for the amount of money that they've funded this other dark money group with, or whatever, and back on down the line until you get to a real source. I think that law is currently under challenge, and so we'll kind of see what comes with it, and I'm not sure how strong enforcement really is right now. The answer, unfortunately, is just not very good. There's not a good way to get to that data.
Anna from the Miami Herald asked, what states require C4s report their donors?
California is the leading example there. There are some others where if the C4 itself makes an expenditure, then it has to do the kind of reporting that I just described, but then they'll just set up a PAC and give to that PAC, and then the PAC is the only thing subject to that disclosure because it made the expenditure.
All right, those are all the questions in the queue as of right now. It's 1:45. So if you're able to get to the next segment or the governance segment, and then we'll have a few more minutes for questions after that.
Sounds great. So on our homepage here, there is a tool that I will draw your attention to called the My Legislature Tool. Excuse me. So it's down under the map in our tools section. Lots of different stuff in here, including different ways to get to a couple of the data sets. This is the My Legislature Tool. Unfortunately, I am still personally working on populating legislative committees for 2021. So I'm going to use 2020 as a demo here, but we can select any state that we'd like. I'm grabbing Wisconsin. And this takes you to the My Legislature page for Wisconsin. There are a couple of things on here that take about 10 seconds to load. So I've preloaded this page and we'll take a look at what's available here. We start with the list of all of the sitting legislators in the state. The legislative leadership, so you can see who's in charge in each chamber. And then the top contributors to sitting legislators in Wisconsin. This is career. And then you can also break down recent contributions by political party affiliation. And then this is a list of other elected office holders in Wisconsin. Wisconsin elects their judicial offices, so there's a big slate there. But then you have your more traditional governor and secretary of state and so forth. But within this, the main power of this tool is if you're tracking a piece of legislation and you're interested in looking at the campaign finance angle for considering legislation. We have a bill feed for every piece of legislation introduced in every session in every state. And this comes from a for-profit corporation called Legiscan. We have a data sharing agreement with them where we get some of their bill information and sponsorship information in exchange for some of our campaign finance information. Within this tool, what I'm going to do is jump down to a specific bill here. I'm going to use Assembly Bill 237. And if I click on this bill, then it's going to give me some information, and this is all streaming from Legiscan through an API. So it's another example of how versatile APIs can be. The overview of the bill from the state, the list of sponsors of this piece of legislation. Some states only allow one sponsor per bill. Some states allow many. And then the top donors to the sponsors of the piece of legislation. And I guess I waited too long to get here. It is reloading it, but so these are those dozen or so sponsors that we have. These are the top donors to their campaigns over the years. We can also look at what has happened with the bill. So which committees it got referred to and so forth. In this case, this bill got referred to the Assembly Committee on Workforce Development. If this was in live action, then we could go to that committee. And so look at this committees tab. And this is the membership list that I was talking about that I'm working on for 2021. This is a membership list of every standing committee in every legislature in every state. So if we click on the Workforce Development Committee, we get a list of the committee members, including the chairmanships. Excuse me. And then we can look at contributions to members of this committee. And this is again career. So, and then there's an industry analysis tool that is trying to look at how members of this committee fare in their fundraising from different economic interests in comparison to members of the legislature as a whole, with the bars kind of representing what members of the committee are raising compared to members of the legislature in general. This one is looking a little wonky. It was looking better this morning. We're making some server changes, so I'm wondering if that's impacting that. And then about the data. And if we click on the about the data, this takes us to this button that actually, this is sort of buried, but allows you to look at contributions to members of that legislative committee on that Ask Anything interface. I took a moment earlier to point out that on the Ask Anything interface itself, you can do contributions to office holders on a legislative committee. that is another way to get here. So you can actually just do this and type in Wisconsin House and find the Workforce Development Committee and get to the same data set. And what we're looking at now are career contributions raised by members of this legislative committee. And we can group that by, for example, the office holder, in which office they're in, and include all of that information. We can add a breakdown of the contributor and all of the economic classification information. So now this table is going to show me how much money Patrick Snyder, for example, received from the Wisconsin Republican Assembly Campaign Committee, which we've classified as a party committee, 9 contributions for $183,000. And you can go down the list and start getting into some of those private communications, private donations, so like Clear Channel Communications, for example. And so this is our effort to try to allow you, as you're working on a campaign or a legislation story, to really start looking at where the money is coming from for the people that are sponsoring a piece of legislation or considering it in a committee. We can also do, just on a new Ask Anything search, you can do contributions to office holders and type of office. And then within the state, we'll just grab the state Senate and state House. If you're working on a piece of legislation where it's perhaps up for a floor vote and you want to take a look at the contributions to all of the legislative members in your state, and then we'll do contributions to a specific state. And for this demo, I'll just grab Alaska. Now we're looking at contributions to sitting legislators in Alaska. And you can do the same breakdown. So you've got a list of where they're getting their money from for each individual in here. So this is all very raw data that is queried in a way to try to tie it into stories that are focused on governance. There is also a tool that we've launched relatively recently that is trying to package it into a more visual presentation. And if we go to our tools, we've got quite a few tools that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but this power mapping tool is one that has a couple of characteristics on it that are very interesting. And what I'm going to do here is just grab Wisconsin. And what we're seeing with this chart right now is a list of everybody involved in the legislative process. So the senators, the members of the assembly, governors, I'm going to switch this to 21, and the lieutenant governor. The y-axis here, the up and down axis is, actually switch that back, is trying to rank these people based on how much power they have over the legislative process. And so what it's doing is showing the governor at the top, who has signing or veto power. And then you'll see the Senate president is typically next, followed by the Speaker of the House, and then the rank and file based on things such as how many legislative committees they sit on, how many committees they chair, and that sort of thing, trying to map that power. We're going to grab a specific legislative committee. And in this case, I'm just going to grab the Energy Committee. And so now we're just mapping members of a specific state house committee in Wisconsin. The reason I want to bring this up is because if you're reporting on an issue, and advocates actually use this too, but if you're reporting on an issue or a piece of legislation, you can map out in this committee, for example, how likely members of the committee are to support or oppose the piece of legislation based on their campaign contributions. Obviously, there are a lot of other factors that come to play, but their campaign contributions is what we do. And so this is meant to add to that kind of an assessment. So for example, if you can plug in a bill. We'll just grab from the regular session, and you can plug in a bill. And if the sponsor of a bill is a member of this committee, then that sponsor will move into the right side of the x-axis here, which indicates that that person is likely to be more supportive of the bill because they sponsored it. But we can also do things like industry breakdowns. So if you're working on, here in Wisconsin, we're working on an energy industry bill, and perhaps the industry is unfavorable to it, then we can say that the energy industry is opposed to this piece of legislation. And this is just some gradient of support and opposition that you plug in. And perhaps the labor unions are very much in support. And of course, labor has been a big deal in Wisconsin in recent years. And what this is doing now is mapping out the members of this legislative committee based on the campaign contributions they've received from the energy industry and from the labor unions, to try to map out what they might, how supportive or unsupportive they may be on this particular bill or general issue. Each one of these dots is an actual human, and you can click on that person to get information about their campaign finance, the money that is involved with this particular query that we've done with energy and labor. And this person has not received any labor money, but has only received a little bit of energy money as well. And so just slightly to the left on the map here. And then one of the things that is also worth keeping in mind on this is that we use donor contribution patterns to assign partisan alignment of campaign contributors. An AT&T, for example, will have a partisan alignment of essentially 0. They give to incumbents, and they don't care what party you are, which is a common approach of most for-profit interests. Individuals tend to give on a more partisan basis, and ideological groups as well. Unions tend to lean a little bit more Democratic. However, they will give to Republicans in states where they need to. But what we're doing here is each of these individuals on this committee is now being mapped out based on this being a potentially partisan issue, based on their party alignment, which is derived from whether they receive contributions from donors who are overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democratic. And so we're able to do different mapping like this. This kind of thing also, we geocode contributions. And so if you're working on stories about redistricting in the next couple of years, we may have some options to help you out with that kind of thing and what maps might look like. So that's a lot to kind of cram in for a few minutes on this, but I did want to highlight this tool as well. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we got a few more minutes. I am as somebody who puts together programs to see fellows say, whoa, that's awesome, and whoa, I can't wait to test this feature out. My day's done, I'm gonna call it a day, call it a week. That's what I'd love to see. It's a great tool, and I'm glad we were able to introduce it to the fellows. But we have time for a couple more questions if anybody has. Let me see. No. One fellow who's using it for a story this weekend, but Lucille. So go for it, Lucille.
Hi, I'm really excited about this. I don't know how I didn't know about this before because it makes my job way easier. But I'm clicking around looking at races, like how much different candidates got in elections. And if I'm looking by industry, I can't figure out how to separate it out by year. Can you run through that one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we are on the Ask Anything search, if you are doing contributions to, this is a pop in here. If you're doing contributions to campaigns in a specific state, for example, so we're doing contributions, and I'll just grab Alabama. And I'm just going to look at state level, and I'm skipping over a lot of this, but again, don't struggle with these interfaces. Just give me a call, and our number's at the bottom of every page on our site. And it is what we're here for, and it's nice to get out of the spreadsheets. You can break it down by year by adding this election year box. And so if you're looking at contributions across time, this is the way to do that, and it will break it out with any other breakdowns that you have too. So if you've got it broken out by sector, then it will aggregate by sector and year.
Okay, I think I got to it in a roundabout way. Thank you.
You bet.
Lauren Gibbons, do you still have a question?
Oh yeah, I just had a question, and this is just more generally speaking. Pete, do you or anyone else on staff, in addition to answering some of the technical questions, do you get quoted by news organizations, or do you offer interviews to kind of provide context on whether a specific, like if I had a question about whether a specific donation was weird compared to what other states do or that kind of thing, is that something that you're open to?
All the time. Yep.
Okay.
So, and I'm typically the one to take those. So you'll get to talk to me again. But yes, we are happy to talk about what the data means in terms of like its context in campaign finance spheres. We will not get into ethical questions, so I won't be able to answer those, but certainly describing what's normal based on what normally happens and that sort of thing, talking about how regulations impact what data you might see and how elections work, all that kind of stuff.
All right, Sam.
If you do ask us a question that is outside of our purview, something that we can't comment on, as we maintain our nonpartisan status, we won't get into things that might look potentially partisan just as a comment. Then we may be able to find other organizations or things that are too legal for us to answer. I can answer some basic questions there, but we may be able to provide you with contact information for somebody else that will be a good resource too. That's another thing that we do. And the Campaign Legal Center actually is one of the ones that we refer to people to a lot.
Okay, and final question. Sam, did you still have a question?
Pete kind of answered it. I've quoted you before in stories and just wanted to ask about the parameters of what you guys can comment on. It's kind of been about some of the gotcha nuggets that you find in this data. And yeah, I just wanted to ask about the parameters of what you guys comment on. So you answered it. Thank you.
Feel free to call me up and ask me. If I can't answer it, I'll just tell you that I can't.
Awesome.
But I can at the very least kind of tell you, maybe not offhand, but after a few minutes of research, like whether what you're seeing is unusual.
In like broader context, yeah. Awesome, thank you.
Okay, and last question of the day and the fellowship to Anna.
Hi, Pete. I have a question regarding the nationwide context, I guess. We have been doing stories on dark money and the influence on one election, and we found that it was a C4 registered in Delaware, and so it was really hard to know. And then after the election, the name of the donor changed, and it was also a C4 in Delaware that led to a UPS store. Is that usually like how it works, like in terms of like how popular is Delaware for dark money groups? Just hide there.
Delaware is known for its opaqueness on certain kinds of corporate registrations.
Right.
I haven't looked extensively at the addresses of dark money groups, but the disclosure requirements for dark money groups are really, as far as where they get their money from, if they engage in politics in a state, are really reliant on the state in which that political activity is happening. So if they make contributions to an election in South Dakota, for example, the disclosure requirements that they would have to report to the South Dakota Elections Agency or Campaign Finance Agency would be dictated by the South Dakota political disclosure laws. The 501c4s they're just hard in general. There aren't places that make that information really available wholesale anywhere. And the IRS ostensibly has traditionally received information from these organizations about who their contributors are so that they can validate their tax exempt status. But the IRS won't share that information. It doesn't see itself as a political disclosure agency. On the contrary, its mission is to keep data private because it's very much tax information. So what we're really relying on here is the idea that political agencies will and legislatures will push for political disclosure laws.
Has the IRS gone after any C4s or like, because I know there's like a contribution limit, right? Isn't it like 50% threshold that has to be political activity? Sorry.
So yeah, so the I don't know the answer on the enforcement from the IRS, but the 50% threshold that you're talking about is basically with 501c4s in particular, they can't spend more than, they can't have a primary purpose, and that's the legal term of political activity. Colloquially, that just means that they can't spend most of their money on political activity. So the IRS is defining that as like 50% plus one. And the difficult part with this is that what the IRS defines as political activity is conservative compared to what you and I might think about as political activity. Again, because they're trying to really get after groups that are overtly breaking the rules. So things that are at the federal level referred to as electioneering communications, independent expenditure ads, basically that don't expressly advocate for or against a candidate, that aren't saying vote yes or vote no, but are instead just think of the ads where the candidate is showing up in black and white with like thunder and lightning in the background. This person is terrible and that kind of stuff. But stopping short right before the election, but stopping short of saying vote yes or no, wouldn't necessarily qualify as a political ad under IRS rules. And actually doesn't qualify as a political ad under a lot of state rules too, about half of the states.
Wow. Okay. They were promoting a no party candidate, not a specific campaign. I know it's
Also it's partisan elections specifically where that becomes a real issue for the IRS.